Right now, while you are watching this, somebody is being paid to stare at a screen and wait for the worst night of their career. It is 3 in the morning where they are. 4 of them are awake, covering an organization of 40,000 people. And in 2025, the median intruder sat inside a breach network for 14 days before anybody noticed. That number is not an estimate. It comes from more than 500,000 hours of frontline incident response, and it went up from the year before, not down. This is the job that decides which side of that number you end up on. And almost nobody outside the industry can describe what it actually involves. In the next half hour, you will find out what a security operations center really is, what happens to the human body on permanent night shift, why the single most famous breach in retail history was detected correctly and still happened anyway, and the 22-second figure that has quietly broken the entire model. You will also leave knowing exactly what to ask about the people watching your data, if you ever have to. Start with what the room is. A security operations center, everyone says SOC, is the function inside an organization whose entire job is continuous monitoring. Not building things, not fixing things, watching. It may genuinely be a room with wall screens and a horseshoe of desks because executives like showing that room to visitors. It may equally be 11 people scattered across 3 countries who have never met in person. The architecture matters far less than the rota, because the defining constraint of this profession is that it cannot stop. An attacker does not respect your office hours. In fact, your office hours are useful information to them, freely published, and the quietest hours of your week are the most attractive hours of theirs. So the work is structured in tiers. The first tier receives whatever the tools produce and triages it. Is this real? Is it urgent? Does it go further? It is relentless, high volume, and it is where almost everybody starts. The second tier takes what survives triage and investigates properly. Pulling logs, reconstructing what a machine did and in what order, deciding whether one strange login is a person on holiday with a new phone or the first 10 minutes of something catastrophic. Above that sit the people who go looking without being prompted, hunting for the intrusions that never generated an alert at all, on the assumption that the tools have already missed something. Which, as we will see, is a well-founded assumption. It helps to know what is actually on the screens, because the imagery in films is wrong in a specific way. There is no green code raining down anything. There are tables, long, dense tables of events, with filters applied to them, and a chat window where the team argues about what they are looking at. The central tool is a platform that swallows logs from everything the organization owns, every login, every process that started on every laptop, every connection to every external address, and lets an analyst ask questions of that pile. Which machine talked to this address? What ran immediately before? Who was logged in at the time? The skill is not typing quickly. The skill is knowing what normal looks like in this specific organization, so that abnormal announces itself. That an accountant's laptop runs a scripting tool at 2 in the morning is only alarming if you know that accountants here never do that. Nothing in any manual can tell you that. You learn it by sitting there for a year. Then there is the shape of the coverage. Larger organizations run follow the sun. A team in one time zone hands the watch to a team in the next, so the screens are never unwatched and nobody has to live nocturnally forever. That is the good version. The common version is a smaller team covering nights themselves, on rotation, with a skeleton crew handling the same flood of alerts that overwhelms the full-strength day shift. The alert volume does not drop at night. The number of people looking at it does. And that is the first thing that should genuinely worry you about this profession. Stated plainly, for a substantial part of every day, the organizations you trust with your data are being watched by their smallest, most tired complement of staff. Which brings us to what the night itself does to them. 3 in the morning is not simply a late hour. It is a specific physiological state. And it is arguably the worst possible time to ask a human being to make a fine judgment about ambiguous evidence. Your body runs a clock. Core temperature falls. Alertness bottoms out. Reaction time lengthens. And the willingness to do effortful thinking drops away in the small hours. regardless of how much you believe you are a night person. Shift workers do not adapt to this the way the folklore claims. They accumulate a debt. And the consequences are not merely a matter of feeling tired. In June 2019, a working group at the International Agency for Research on Cancer, 27 experts from 16 countries reviewed the evidence and classified night shift work as probably carcinogenic to humans. Group 2A. Be precise about what that classification means, because it is routinely mangled in both directions. Group 2A is the second highest confidence tier. It rested on limited evidence in humans, combined with sufficient evidence in animals and strong mechanistic evidence with disruption of the circadian system as the proposed route. Limited is the operative word, and it is the agency's own word. This is not a statement that night work gives you cancer. It is a statement that a serious international body looked hard and concluded the link is probable enough to classify. Now hold that next to the job description. We have built a profession whose core function is careful, skeptical, high-stakes reasoning. And we have arranged for a large share of it to be performed during the hours when careful, skeptical reasoning is physiologically hardest. Ask anybody who has worked those shifts, and they describe the same texture. The hours between about 2 and 5 are the ones where the room goes quiet, the coffee stops working, and every alert starts to look equally gray. That is the exact window an experienced attacker will choose, if they get to choose. Not because of anything mystical about the dark, but because it is the moment when the people are fewest and slowest and the escalation path is longest. The on-call manager is asleep, and waking them has a social cost. There is one ritual in this profession worth describing, because it is where the risk actually lives: the handover. At the end of every shift, the outgoing team has to transfer not just a list of open items, but a state of mind, the half-formed suspicion, the thing that looked odd at midnight and was never resolved. Lists transfer well, suspicion does not. The item that reads as investigated, inconclusive, closing at the end of a 12-hour shift is frequently the same item somebody would have pushed harder on with fresh attention. Every experienced analyst has a story that begins with something handed over as probably nothing. There is a version of this job that is genuinely satisfying. Sharp people, real puzzles, immediate feedback, and the occasional night where you catch something and prevent a disaster nobody will ever hear about. That version exists. The version that has become common is different, and it has less to do with the hours than with what arrives on the screen once you are sitting there. Here's the part that surprises people who have never done it. The problem in a modern SOC is almost never a shortage of information. It is the opposite, by an enormous margin. Every security product an organization buys generates alerts. Endpoint tools, network tools, cloud platforms, identity systems, email filtering. Each one is tuned by a vendor who would far rather warn you about something harmless than stay silent about something real, because one of those failures ends up in a headline with their name on it. So the incentives of the entire industry push in one direction: generate the alert. The cost of a false alarm lands on the analyst. The cost of a misdetection lands on the vendor's reputation. Guess which way that gets tuned? The result arrives on the night shift as volume. Thousands of events a day in a mid-sized organization arriving continuously, each one nominally requiring a human decision. And most of them are nothing. In the 2025 SANS Detection and Response Survey, 73% of security teams named false positives as their single biggest detection challenge, ahead of attacker sophistication, ahead of budget, ahead of everything else. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the point where documentaries reach for a dramatic statistic and quietly invent one. You will find figures online claiming 30% of alerts are ignored, or 63%, or that only a minority are ever investigated. Those numbers come from different vendor surveys with different definitions of alert, different populations, and a commercial interest in the answer. Several of the most repeated versions cannot be traced back to any primary report at all. So this episode will not give you a single number, because there is not an honest one to give. What can be said, and what everyone inside the field will tell you, is this: A large share of alerts is never meaningfully examined by a human being, and no one can tell you reliably how large. That absence is itself the finding. Because think about what it means operationally. The defense of an organization depends on a triage process whose failure rate nobody measures, performed under time pressure, at volume, frequently at night. And the individual decisions are genuinely hard, which is the part that gets lost when this is discussed as a staffing problem. Consider an ordinary one. A user account signs in successfully from a country the organization does not operate in. That is either a stolen credential being used by somebody who bought it an hour ago, or a sales director who did not mention they were traveling. Both are common. The evidence on the screen is identical. To resolve it, you either dig for 20 minutes through other signals, or you telephone somebody at 3 in the morning and risk being the analyst who wakes an executive over a holiday. Now multiply that by several hundred across one shift with 4 people. The failure mode is not that anyone is careless. It is that the correct answer takes 20 minutes and the queue arrives every 90 seconds. And when the volume becomes genuinely impossible, teams do the rational thing. The SANS survey reports it directly, they suppress the noisy detection rules, the alerts stop, the workload becomes survivable. And a blind spot opens, in exactly the place that was making the most noise. Nobody involved is negligent. Every individual decision is defensible. The system still ends up not watching something, which is precisely what happened in the case everybody in this profession knows by heart. 2013, the American retailer Target. And the reason this case is taught rather than merely remembered is that it is not a story about a defense that failed. It is a story about a defense that worked. Roughly 6 months before, the company had deployed a sophisticated and expensive malware detection product from FireEye. This was not an underinvested organization cutting corners. This was a company that had bought the good tool. They also had people watching it. A monitoring team in Bangalore was staffed to receive what the system produced, the follow the sun model, working exactly as designed. At the end of November, as the American holiday shopping season began, the system detected unfamiliar malware operating inside Target's network. It generated alerts. The Bangalore team saw them and did their job. They escalated to the security team in Minneapolis. And then, according to the reporting that broke the story, nothing happened. The notifications went without a response. Stop and hold that, because it inverts everything people assume about breaches. The intrusion was not invisible. The technology detected it. The humans on watch escalated it correctly. The system produced exactly the output it was purchased to produce. There is a further detail that makes it sharper. The product had a function that could have deleted the malware automatically, on detection, with no human involvement at all. That function had been switched off. That is not stupidity either, and it deserves saying because it is the most misunderstood part of the story. Security teams routinely disable automatic action, precisely because an automated tool that deletes the wrong thing in a payment environment can take a business offline on its busiest trading day. So every individual decision in that chain was defensible. Buy the good tool, staff the watch, escalate what you see. Do not let software delete things unsupervised in production. The outcome was roughly 40 million payment cards exposed, along with personal data for something in the region of 70 million customers, and a case study that has been taught for over a decade since. I am not going to tell you the breach would have been prevented if somebody in Minneapolis had picked up that alert. Nobody knows that, and the honest version of the story does not need it. What it establishes is narrower and far more uncomfortable. Detection is not the hard part. Detection was solved. The hard part is the last few meters. A human being, among hundreds of competing signals, correctly identifying which one of tonight's alerts is the one that matters, and being believed when they say so. That is the job. And after Target, the industry set out to fix it, not by buying more tools, but by finally agreeing on a language. To understand what changed, you have to understand how detection used to work, because it explains why the flood exists in the first place. For years, defense was built around indicators, a specific malicious file, identified by its fingerprint, a specific server address, a specific domain name. You collected lists of these known bad items and watched for them appearing. The trouble is obvious once stated. All of those are trivially cheap for an attacker to change. Recompile the file and the fingerprint changes. Rent a different server and the address changes. Register a new domain for a few dollars. The defender's expensive list is worthless by Tuesday. What does not change nearly so easily is behavior. Whatever an attacker's tooling looks like this week, they still have to get in, establish persistence, escalate privilege, move sideways through the network, find the data, and get it out. Those steps are structural. They are what the objective requires. In 2013, Maitri, an American not-for-profit that runs research work for government, began an internal project along exactly those lines, out of an effort known as the Fort Meade experiment. The question was whether endpoint telemetry and analytics could catch attackers already inside a network after the perimeter had failed. To do that, they had to write down systematically what intruders actually do once they are in, not which malware they used, what behaviors they performed, in what order, and how each one might be observed. In May 2015, they released the first public version for enterprise Windows environments, 9 tactics, and 96 techniques. The name is an acronym: Adversarial Tactics, Techniques, and Common Knowledge. Everyone just says ATT and CK. And it spread with unusual speed for a security framework, for a reason that has little to do with technology. It gave the profession a shared vocabulary. An analyst in Rotterdam and an analyst in Sao Paulo could now describe the same attacker behavior with the same identifier, and mean precisely the same thing. That sounds like documentation. It is closer to infrastructure. Before it, every vendor, every team, and every report used its own private terminology, which meant threat intelligence could not be compared, detections could not be audited, and no team could honestly answer the question of what they could and could not see. Afterwards, a SOC could lay its detections against the matrix and find its own gaps. Here are the behaviors we would catch, and here, in writing, are the ones that would walk straight past us. Being able to state your blind spots precisely is not a small thing. It is most of what maturity means in this field. A concrete example makes the shift obvious. One documented behavior is the abuse of legitimate administrative tools already installed on the machine. The intruder does not bring software with them. They use the utilities the operating system ships with, because those cannot be blocked without breaking the computer. Against an indicator list that is invisible, there is no malicious file to match, because there is no file. Against a behavioral catalog, it has a name, an identifier, and a documented set of ways to observe it. And an analyst who has read it knows to ask why a machine in accounts payable is suddenly running administrative tooling at all. That framework is now the closest thing the profession has to a common language, and it came out of the same period as the Target case, aimed at the same problem. The intruder is already inside, and the question is whether anyone will recognize them. So did any of it work? We can answer that because one number has been tracked consistently for over a decade, and it is the closest thing this profession has to a scoreboard. It is called dwell time, how long an attacker is present inside a network before somebody detects them. Back in 2014, the global median was around 205 days, 7 months of an intruder living in the environment unnoticed. By the 2025 reporting, it had fallen to 11 days. That is one of the genuinely great improvements in the history of the field, and the people on those night shifts did it, largely by learning to hunt for behavior instead of waiting for a matching fingerprint. Then came the figures published in March 2026, drawn from more than 500,000 hours of frontline incident response across the previous year. The global median dwell time was 14 days. It went back up. Alongside it, a genuinely encouraging number. 52% of intrusions were first detected by the organization itself, up from 43%. More than half of all breaches are now found by the defenders rather than by a bank, a journalist, or the criminals sending a ransom note. That is the night shift working. And then the number that reframes everything else in this episode. The median time between an initial access event and handoff to a second threat group was 22 seconds. In 2022, the same measure was more than 8 hours. 22 seconds. Understand what that describes. Intrusion has become an industrialized supply chain. One group's entire business is obtaining access. They sell it automatically, near instantly, to a second group whose business is doing something profitable with it, which quietly destroys an assumption the whole defensive model rests on. Every escalation procedure ever written assumes some human-scale interval between the front door opening and real damage beginning. Time to notice. Time to wake somebody. Time to decide. 22 seconds is not a human interval. By the time a Tier 1 analyst has finished reading the alert, the access has been sold and the new owner is already working. And the average conceals worse. For cyber espionage cases and for incidents involving North Korean IT workers placed inside organizations under false identities, the median dwell time was 122 days. 4 months. Those are the intrusions with no ransom note and no encryption, because being noticed is the one thing that ends the operation. Nothing breaks. Nobody is extorted. Somebody is simply there, quietly, for a third of a year. And that is the category no tool is good at, because there is no moment of damage to detect. Ransomware announces itself. That is the entire business model. An intruder whose objective is to remain has every incentive to look exactly like an ordinary employee doing ordinary work, and largely succeeds. Which is why the hunting tier exists at all. Not to respond to alerts, but to go looking on the assumption that the quiet is not evidence of safety. The only thing that reliably finds a 4-month intrusion is a person who thought something looked slightly wrong and refused to let it go. Which brings us to the cost, and to the reason this episode belongs in a series about professions rather than technology. In the 2025 SANS SOC survey, nearly half of the analysts who responded, 47.6%, said they feel very burned out at work. A further 23.7% said somewhat burned out. Read that total again. Around 7 in 10 people doing this work describe themselves as burned out to some degree, not dissatisfied, not underpaid. Burned out, which is a specific condition with a specific trajectory, and it ends in people leaving. The same survey measured that too. 23% of leaders reported losing up to 19% of their staff, and some respondents reported losing 40% or more of their teams. 42% said average tenure is shrinking compared with the past. Now connect that to everything already established, because the loop is vicious and entirely mechanical. Experience is the thing that lets an analyst distinguish a real signal from noise. Experience takes years to build inside a specific environment. You learn what normal looks like here, shorten tenure, and you delete that. The team gets younger, the flood stays constant, and the proportion of alerts handled by someone who has not yet learned this network's ordinary weirdness goes up, which raises the miss rate, which produces the incident, which produces the crisis weekend, the post-mortem, the additional monitoring tool, and more alerts, which accelerates the burnout that started it. It also explains the rules suppression from earlier. When you are exhausted and the queue is unbounded, turning off the noisiest detector is not laziness. It is the only lever an individual actually has. There is something specific about this job that ordinary stress language does not capture. Most demanding professions have a completion state. The shift ends, the patient is stable, the ship has docked. Here, a quiet night is indistinguishable from a night where you missed everything. There is no signal that says you did well. The absence of catastrophe is the only feedback, and it is exactly the same feedback you would get if you had been asleep at the desk. People can tolerate enormous pressure with clear feedback. It is the ambiguity that erodes them. And underneath all of it is the knowledge that the thing you missed does not stay abstract. It becomes somebody's medical records, somebody's salary payments, a hospital, diverting ambulances. That is a heavy thing to carry at 4 in the morning with 3 colleagues and 1,100 open alerts. There is a term for that particular injury, borrowed from military and medical research, moral injury. It is not the same as stress. It is the specific damage done by being placed in a position where you are responsible for an outcome you were never given the resources to control. That describes the night shift of an understaffed SOC with uncomfortable precision. The responsibility is real, the accountability is real, and the queue was never survivable. People do not leave this profession because it is difficult. They leave because they can no longer carry being answerable for something they were structurally unable to do. The obvious response is to hire more people. That has been the industry's answer for a decade, and it is worth looking at what happened to it. For years, the headline was a single dramatic number, a global shortfall of cybersecurity professionals measured in the millions. The 2024 workforce study put the gap at around 4.8 million against an active workforce of about 5.5 million, a shortfall roughly the size of the entire existing profession. By the 2025 study, surveying a record 16,029 professionals, the framing had shifted in a way that is more useful and more uncomfortable. The pressing problem was no longer purely headcount, it was skills. The finding that ought to be quoted more than it is, 88% of organizations reported experiencing security incidents attributable to skill shortages, not to a lack of tools, and not simply to a lack of bodies, to the gap between what the people had been trained for and what was actually arriving on their screens. Which is a different problem with a different solution, and a much slower one. You can hire 100 junior analysts in a quarter if you are prepared to pay. You cannot manufacture 5 years of pattern recognition in a quarter at any price. And the two problems feed each other. The shortage means the experienced people are overloaded. Overload means they have no time to train the juniors. Untrained juniors miss things, which produces incidents, which consumes what remained of the experienced people's time. This is the honest reason your data is watched by fewer, tireder, less experienced people than the marketing suggests. Not indifference and not stinginess. A pipeline problem that the industry has been describing accurately for 10 years and is not solved. There is a real argument that automation changes this. That machine triage removes the crushing tier 1 volume and frees humans for the judgment work. Some of that is genuinely happening. Much of what is claimed about it is vendor marketing, and this episode is not going to pretend to know which will dominate. What can be said is that the 22-second number makes some form of automated response arithmetically unavoidable. No rota of human beings, however well-staffed and however awake, operates on that timescale. So what do you actually do with all this, whether you work in this field, near it, or simply hand your data to organizations that do? 1. Detection is not the problem. Response is. The target case is the permanent proof, the tool worked, the analyst escalated, and the outcome was still one of the largest retail breaches on record. If you are ever assessing a security team, as an employee, a customer, or a board member, do not ask what they can detect. Ask what happens in the 20 minutes after something fires at 3 in the morning and who has authority to act without waking anybody. 2. Ask about the night, specifically. Coverage claims are made about the whole day and quietly averaged. The questions that matter are, how many people are actually watching between 2 and 5 in the morning? Is it the same team as the day shift on rotation? And how long is the escalation path when the manager is asleep? That is where the risk concentrates and where almost nobody looks. 3. Treat any alert statistic you are quoted as marketing until proven otherwise. The most repeated numbers in this field trace back to vendor surveys with a commercial interest in the answer, and several cannot be traced to a primary source at all. Ask who ran the study, who paid for it, how alert was defined, and how many organizations responded. That habit is worth more than any tool. And 4, if you are considering this work, it is genuinely one of the few jobs left where a sharp person without a traditional background can become dangerous quickly, because the work is pattern recognition and the patterns are public. The ATT and CK framework is free, and everything in it describes what real intruders actually do. Go in with your eyes open about the shift pattern and about the fact that success in this profession is invisible by definition. Because that is the thing worth carrying out of this episode. Almost everything that has gone right in this field is unmeasurable. Every night an organization does not appear in the news, somebody was watching, and something did not happen. Dwell time fell from 205 days to 11 over a decade. 52% of intrusions are now caught by the defenders themselves. Nobody applauded either of those, because the evidence for them is in absence. The people who did that are not in the room when the breach is announced, and they are not thanked when it is not. They are at a desk at 3 in the morning, on their 4th night in a row, looking at an alert that is almost certainly nothing, and deciding to check it anyway. Next Sunday on Secret Professions, the ransomware negotiators. The people who are paid to sit down and bargain with criminals holding a hospital's files, what they are actually allowed to say, and what happens in the room when the clock runs out. If you got something out of this, subscribe, and I will see you next Sunday. What?